Have you ever found yourself sitting at home, wondering if you should call someone just to fill the silence? Or maybe you felt a little guilty for not keeping up with friends the way you used to? If so, I want you to take a deep breath and let me tell you something important. That's perfectly okay. In fact, it might even be a good thing. You see, as we get older, our lives change, our priorities shift, our energy levels adjust, and what once felt necessary, well, sometimes it just doesn't anymore. And that's not a loss. It's freedom. It's growth. Today, we're going to talk about why you don't need friends after 70. At least, not in the way you might think. And more than that, we'll explore how embracing independence can actually lead to a happier, more fulfilling life. Now, before we go any further, if this idea speaks to you, if you've ever felt the weight of social expectations or wondered if you're doing it wrong, then do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're new here, welcome. Consider subscribing to Elderly Life for more conversations just like this one. Because here we talk about real life, no fluff, no pressure, just honest talk for folks who've earned the right to live on their own terms. Let's start with something we all feel but don't always say out loud. As we age, our energy isn't what it used to be. And that's not a bad thing. It's just reality. When you were younger, you might have had the stamina for long phone calls, frequent visits, and keeping up with dozens of people. But now, every bit of energy counts. And that means you get to decide where it goes. Think about the last time you spent an afternoon with someone out of obligation rather than genuine desire. Maybe it was a lunch date with someone who talks endlessly about their problems. Or a family gathering where you felt drained, just trying to keep up with conversations. How did you feel afterward? Exhausted? Relieved it was over? That's your intuition telling you something important. Not all social interactions are worth the cost. Here's the truth. After 70, you've earned the right to be selective. If a friendship feels like a chore, if it leaves you tired instead of uplifted, it's okay to step back. That doesn't mean you're selfish or ungrateful. It means you're honoring your own well-being. And when you do, something beautiful happens. You free up energy for the things that truly light you up. Maybe it's painting, gardening, traveling, or simply sitting in your favorite chair with a good book. That's not loneliness. That's living on your terms. Now, let's talk about something we rarely admit. Not every friendship is good for us. Some relationships linger out of habit, nostalgia, or even guilt. Maybe you've known someone for decades, but over time, the connection has faded. Or perhaps there's a friend who subtly undermines you, always questioning your choices or making little comments that leave you feeling small. I'll give you an example. A viewer named Margaret once wrote to me about a friend she'd known since college. They used to be close, but over the years, her friend became critical, always telling her she was too old to try new things, dismissing her hobbies, even making jokes about her independence. Margaret told me, "Every time we talked, I felt worse about myself, but I kept thinking, we've been friends for 50 years. I can't just walk away." But here's the thing. Time invested doesn't always equal value. A friendship that drains your joy or makes you doubt yourself isn't a friendship. It's an emotional tax. And after 70, you don't owe anyone your peace. Letting go isn't about being cruel. It's about choosing yourself. Because when you release relationships that no longer serve you, you create space for people who truly align with who you are now. Or, just as powerfully, you make room for the quiet contentment of your own company. This brings me to a point many people misunderstand. Being alone doesn't mean being lonely. In fact, solitude can be one of the most empowering states of all. Think about it. When was the last time you had uninterrupted time to just be? No expectations, no small talk, no compromising? For many of us, that's rare. But after 70, it can become your greatest gift. Take a moment to imagine a day entirely on your terms. You wake up when you want. You eat what you crave. You spend your time exactly as you please, whether that's puttering in the garden, writing letters, or simply sitting with a cup of tea, watching the birds. There's no one to answer to, no one to accommodate. That's not isolation. That's freedom. Studies even show that older adults who embrace solitude often report higher levels of creativity, self-awareness, and emotional resilience. Why? Because when you're not constantly adjusting to others, you reconnect with yourself. You remember what you love, what you believe, and how you want to spend your precious time. And that's a kind of happiness no amount of socializing can replace. Now, you might be thinking, but what if I do want company sometimes? And that's a great question, because independence doesn't mean cutting off all human connection. In fact, the next thing we'll talk about is how to cultivate relationships that truly enrich your life without the weight of obligation. But we'll save that for just a little later. Now, let's pick up right where we left off. We've talked about how precious your energy is after 70, how not all friendships serve you anymore, and why solitude can be such a gift. But I want to dive deeper into something important, the kind of connections that actually do matter at this stage of life. Because here's the beautiful truth. When you let go of what doesn't fulfill you, you make room for what truly does. Remember when you were younger, and you might have measured your social life by how many people you knew, how many invitations you got, how many names were in your address book. Well, after 70, something shifts. It's not about how many people you know. It's about how deeply you connect with the few who truly matter. Let me tell you about my neighbor, Robert. At 75, he decided to stop attending his weekly card game with a group he'd known for years. Why? Because he realized he didn't actually enjoy it anymore. The conversations were repetitive, the jokes were stale, and he always came home feeling like he'd wasted an evening. But here's what he did instead. He started having coffee every other week with just one friend from that group, a man named Frank. And those 2-hour conversations, they were full of laughter, real talk about life, and the kind of connection Robert had been missing. That's the power of being selective. When you stop spreading your energy thin across surface-level relationships, you create space for the ones that nourish you. Maybe it's one dear friend you see monthly. Maybe it's a family member who truly gets you. Or maybe it's a new friend you meet at a community class. Someone who shares your interests now, not just your past. These are the connections worth keeping. And here's something liberating. You don't have to force these relationships either. Let them unfold naturally. A short, meaningful phone call once in a while. Perfect. A shared hobby that brings you together. Even better, after 70, every interaction should feel like a choice, not an obligation. Now, let's talk about one of the most exciting parts of this journey, the chance to rediscover yourself. Think about it. How much of your life was spent meeting other people's expectations? Being a parent, a spouse, an employee, a caregiver? For many of us, those roles defined us for decades. But now you get to ask, who am I when it's just for me? I'll never forget a letter from a viewer named Helen. At 72, she found herself alone for the first time in her life. Her husband had passed, her kids were grown, and her close friends had moved away. At first, she was terrified of the quiet. But then, something amazing happened. She started trying things she'd never allowed herself to do before. She took a pottery class, even though she'd always been told she wasn't creative. She started traveling alone, booking trips to places she dreamed of but never visited. And one day, she wrote to me, "I've never felt more like myself." That's the magic of independence. Without the noise of others' opinions or the weight of social expectations, you can finally hear your own voice. Maybe you'll rediscover an old passion, painting, writing, gardening. Maybe you'll surprise yourself with a new interest, learning an instrument, volunteering, even starting a small business. Or maybe you'll simply enjoy the peace of knowing you don't have to be anything for anyone else. That's not just freedom, that's rebirth. Finally, let's address the elephant in the room, guilt. So many of us carry this nagging feeling that we should be more social, that we owe people our time, that turning down an invitation makes us a bad friend or family member. But here's what I want you to consider. Where did that guilt come from? Who decided that your worth is tied to how available you are to others? The truth is, after 70, you've earned a right to define your own rules. That doesn't mean cutting people off harshly. It means gently but firmly honoring your needs. Say no when you want to say no. Decline events that drain you. Let go of relationships that feel more like duties than joys. And here's the surprising part. When you do, you'll often find that the people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries. And those who don't, well, that tells you everything you need to know. A viewer named George shared a story that stuck with me. He'd been part of a weekly breakfast club for years, even though he dreaded it. One day, he finally stopped going. He expected backlash, but instead, most of the group didn't even notice. And the one friend who did check in on him became his only real connection from that circle. The rest had just been habit. George said, "I wasted so many mornings worrying about people who weren't really my friends. Now, I spend that time reading or walking, and I've never been happier. That's the liberation of letting go. It's not about rejecting others. It's about choosing yourself. And when you do, you create a life that's authentically yours. Now, I know this might feel like a lot to consider. Maybe you're thinking, but what if I get lonely? Or how do I even start setting these boundaries? Those are important questions. And in our final part, we'll talk about how to navigate this transition with confidence and grace. Because independence isn't about isolation. It's about designing a life that lights you up on your terms. Over these last two parts, we've explored some powerful truths about friendship and independence after 70. But I know what some of you might be thinking right now. This all sounds good in theory, but how do I actually make this shift? What if I feel lonely? What if my family doesn't understand? These are real concerns, and today, in our final part, we're going to address them head on, with practical wisdom and compassionate advice. First, let's be clear. Embracing independence doesn't mean slamming doors or burning bridges. It's about gradual, thoughtful change. Think of it like tending a garden. You're not ripping plants out by their roots. You're simply deciding which ones deserve your care and attention. Start small. That weekly phone call that leaves you drained? Try shortening it by 10 minutes. The monthly lunch date that feels more obligatory than enjoyable? Suggest meeting quarterly instead. You'll quickly notice two things. First, how little these changes are actually noticed by others, and second, how much lighter you feel when you reclaim that time. Margaret, who we mentioned earlier, did this beautifully. When her critical friend would call, she began setting a timer for 20 minutes. When the timer went off, she'd say warmly but firmly, "Oh dear, my neighbor is stopping by soon. I'd better let you go." Over time, these shorter conversations naturally created distance without drama, and the energy she saved, she poured it into her watercolor classes, where she met a like-minded group of artists her age. Now, let's address the loneliness question, because it's important. Independence isn't about isolation. It's about intentional connection. The key is to seek out interactions that align with who you are now, not who you were decades ago. Consider joining a specialized group or class, something that genuinely interests you, not just something to be social. Book clubs, gardening societies, or even online forums about your hobbies can lead to surprisingly meaningful connections. Why? Because these are built on shared passions, not just shared history. Take George, our viewer who left his breakfast club. He discovered a local history group that met once a month to discuss old photographs and stories. The difference? These people cared about what he cared about. The conversations mattered, and because it was only once a month, it never felt like a chore. One of the greatest gifts you can give yourself at this stage of life is the cultivation of rich solo rituals. These are the moments that fill your cup without anyone else's presence or approval. Create a morning routine you love. Maybe tea on the porch while listening to birdsong, or journaling 3 things you're grateful for. Develop evening rituals too. Cooking your favorite meal exactly how you like it, watching that classic movie no one else appreciated, or stargazing in your backyard. Helen, who rediscovered herself through travel, told me something profound. I used to think eating alone in a restaurant was sad. Now, I bring a book I love, order exactly what I crave, and realize this isn't loneliness. This is luxury. That shift in perspective changes everything. Family can be the trickiest part of this transition. Adult children may worry you're isolating yourself. Siblings might take your boundaries personally. Here's how to handle these conversations with grace. First, reassure them, "I appreciate your concern. It comes from love. But this is what makes me happy right now." Share examples of how you're thriving. The books you're reading, the projects you're doing, the peace you found. When they see your genuine contentment, most will relax. For those who persist, try gentle redirection. Instead of Sunday dinners every week, how about we plan one special outing each month? This shows you value the connection while honoring your needs. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with perhaps the most beautiful lesson of all. There comes a point when you realize you are enough, just as you are. Not as a friend, not as a family member, but as yourself. This isn't about rejecting love or connection. It's about reaching a stage of life where you no longer need others to validate your worth or fill your time. The silence becomes comfortable. The solitude becomes sacred. And the relationships you do choose, they're richer because they're truly wanted, not just habitual. So to all of you watching, Whether you're ready to take bold steps or just starting to consider these ideas, know this. What lies ahead isn't emptiness. It's the spaciousness to finally breathe, to grow, to be. And that's not just okay. That's extraordinary. If this series resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced the freedom of independence later in life? What solo rituals bring you joy? Your stories inspire our whole community. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to The Elderly Life for more conversations that honor this chapter of life. Until next time, remember, the best company you'll ever keep is the person you become. Here's to your happiness on your terms.